My name is Gerri Sharpe, Gerri Sharpe. I like to go by Gerri, but my birth name is Geraldine. I am a loud and proud Inuk, and I have no issue finding my voice. I was born in Yellowknife in 1969. Joehaven is my home community. I have lived in Nova Scotia and New Brunswick as well. I also lived for 23 years in Inuvik. I now live in Yellowknife. I've also lived in Rankin as well. The story that I'm sharing is in part mine, mostly my mother's, and stories that I've heard from others while growing up in Joehaven. People need to know. People need to know how strong my mother was. They need to know what she went through and what I went through to achieve my grade 12 and to get where I am now and what I missed out on. I want to share this story so that other generations and the rest of Canada will understand what not only my mother went through, but what I went through and what others going to school gave up, and just what it took to receive an education, but also to understand the importance of why everybody needs to acknowledge the stories and just how hard it was and what everybody went through for that to happen. We don't want to forget it, because otherwise it's for nothing. This is mostly my mother's story, who she is now passed. When I think about it, my mother, up till the day that she died in 2005, was trying to still escape residential school. The impacts that it had on her life were horrendous, and because of that, she lived with a lot of self. She hated herself, but yet loved herself at the same time. And that was a result of things that she went through. As a result, it came down on to me because she was not able to be a mother. So I lost out. When I testified at the TRC, I didn't realize how I viewed things until after I testified, and people witnessing the testimonies came up to me later and said, "You didn't blame your mother." And I hadn't realized that until they said that. They said thank you because they felt so guilty about their own actions, and then the way I explained it about my mother's actions, and it wasn't her fault. She developed coping skills in order to survive, and what I lost was a direct result of that. And when I say what I lost, I mean, I didn't have a mother there when I gave birth. I didn't have parents with me when I graduated. I didn't have parents there when I graduated. I didn't have people to support me, parents, to push me through those hard times. So I can imagine what my mother went through as well, but she took it a step further. She attended residential school from the time that she was 4 until she was 19 when she married my father. She married my father right out of Acatrell Hall. And the hard thing about that is her father, my grandfather, was chosen to be the minister, and he was told that the ministers were the leaders in the community and had to set the examples. So he was told that my mother had to go to school when she was 4, and that it was best for the community because they needed an education. So he had to set the example. My mother was the oldest of 17, and she would only get to go home in the summer for very short periods of time. It wasn't her choice, and my grandfather's choice wasn't his choice either, because he was being told to do it to set the example, being the leader. And when I think back, because even My father died the day before I went to residential school, and my mother was not part of my life until after my father died. Um, and I lived with my grandfather, my mother's father, after my father died, and the amount of phone calls that I made to go home, just crying to go home, and my grandfather, I could hear that pain in his voice. You have to stay. You can't come home. I know it's hard, but you have to do it. And it's my mother at the age of 4 going through that was horrendous. And the stories that I've heard of her when she would look after the others. And when I say look after the others, she often, when she became older, she knew the priests and the nuns, and she observed their behavior. So she would see when they were preying on other children, and she would, I'm told, offer herself up. So she would make herself be in the way so that those children wouldn't get the treatment that she had, because she viewed herself as no good anymore. My mother's story, well, I was born in '69, and the years weren't actually told to me. She was 20 when I was born, so I was born in '69, so it had to have been from the time that she was 4 until 19. So it started in 1950, for her to 1968. And then for when I was in school, it was 85, September of 85 to January of 88. And there was one supervisor that was actually the same supervisor when my mother was going to school. Yeah, that was interesting. My mother went to, I'm told, Inuvik, so she was at Stringer Hall or Grolier Hall. They were both just different churches. She also went to a Clavic, so that was the Immaculate, I can't even remember the one in the Clavic. She was over at the Clavic. She was in Inuvik. She went down to Yellowknife, so a Cathedral Hall in Yellowknife for her, and for me, just a Cathedral Hall. I also went to a Cathedral Hall in Yellowknife from Joehaven. So when I was growing up in Joehaven, students going to school was a big celebration. There was 2 views to it. One, that they were actually going, and it was celebrated in the sense that they had the success of learning and going on and being, all their hope was placed in those that were getting an education. And at the same time, there was parents that absolutely did not want their children to go. And as the stories would be communicated, I loved my children too much to send them to that place. So it's many students. There are stories of parents who would purposely go out hunting and stay away during the times that the students would have to leave, which was the fall in September. So they would take their children, so Joehaven's on King William Island, and across from King William Island, where a lot of people would go hunting for the summer, is Back River and Chantry Inlet. And they would stay out there for months at a time. That's where I used to spend my summers, but we were back in September. There were many, many parents that would purposely stay away because they didn't want their children to be subjected to the same harms. And I remember the stories at the time, because there are parents who love their children and offer everything to their children so that they have safety, but there's also parents that rely heavily on their children for help, especially with big families. And that was the accepted excuse, that they loved them too much or that they needed their help. But there were others that were very truthful about it and said, I'm not going to send my children there because I know what happens. I'm not going to allow that to happen to my children. That they knew, but you didn't talk about it. And it was kind of a survival of the fittest. there were also students that would um, go and not be able to stick it out. They would become very homesick and would go home within the first month. That became a 3 strikes and you're out. So if you did that 3 times, you weren't allowed to go back to school after that. There were definite times that you could see parents and the hurt in their eyes because they wanted to protect their children so much, and they just said no and wouldn't talk about it, and then they would go out camping and they would make sure that they were gone for long periods of time so that their children wouldn't have to go. Camping was an acceptable form of education, because this is during the late 80s, mid 80s, early 80s, it became acceptable to, it was called culture inclusion. It was considered education as well. So there's that was also around the same time that there was an understanding as to why parents didn't want their children to go, and most children my age, before we were going to school, that we can't go to school, get out of Joe Haven. And then I remember my father, he was Kablunak, so he's my father is white. My mother was, and my mother, as I mentioned, is my grandfather's oldest daughter. So I have aunts and uncles that are younger than me. I remember when we came back from Nova Scotia to go to Joe Haven, and I was 15, and I was getting very excited. I was at the end of grade 9, and I was, in grade 9 we were practicing exams, and I was a student that excelled. And if I didn't get 100%, I was disappointed in myself. I loved to learn, I loved to read. And we would have practice exams and practice, I can't remember what those exams are called. Either way, I remember being really devastated with only getting a 97 because the teacher deducted points for spelling errors. So I was really, that hurt me. But then it came to the conversation about where I'd be going in the fall. And I immediately said to my father, yeah, I can't wait to go to Yellowknife, to go to school at Acacia Hall with everybody else, all my friends that I grew up with. And that's when he said, well, no, you're going somewhere else. I'm going to send you to a boarding school. And I was devastated. Why? No, I'm not going to leave. I'm not going to leave my friends. You can't do that to me. I was 15 and very headstrong. You're not going to that place. I know what that place does. And again, he would not tell me. I saw what that place did to your mother. Well, what did it do to my mother? And he wouldn't tell me. And I was so devastated, so affected by this. I for a few weeks, I finally went and spoke to my principal. And the principal had a long meeting with my father, which turned into another meeting with Acacia Hall. And I was not part of those conversations. All I knew is that coming out of that, my father then said that I would be going to Yellowknife to go to school with all my friends, but I would be homeboarding. And I said, well, what's homeboarding? Well, you're not going to stay in the same place. You'll stay with the family in town, but you're not going to that place, Acacia Hall. And again, I was devastated, but happier that I would still be with friends going to school. And I didn't understand. I didn't know why he was making this decision, and he wouldn't tell me why. So I accepted that. Then on September 1st, see, my father was a contractor. He was a general contractor, and he had quite a bit of contracts, and he just received some very lucrative contracts in Joe Haven. And with those contracts that he had just received, there was a large prepayment. So he bought an 18-foot aluminum boat, and he wanted another big boat, but it wasn't going to arrive until the following summer on the barge. So he had this 18-foot aluminum boat that was with a 75 horsepower kicker on the bottom, which is too strong for an 18-foot aluminum boat, very flimsy boat. So if you think It's like these 10, 10 horses pulling this little incy bincy wagon. It's far too much. But my father also liked speed and racing. Um, Joe Haven is on the ocean, um, and that normally it's not calm. The ocean is very windy, and on that Sunday, which was September 1st, 1985, it was oxuerto. It was so calm that you could see your reflection off the water. It was that calm, oxuerto, and which never happens. And he wanted to go for a boat ride in this brand new boat that he had on day 3 because he got it on the Thursday before. And my brother and my sister at the time was 5, my brother was 14, and we're going on this boat, and he opened up that throttle, and it was going so fast. It was, instead of being like this, it was literally like this. And that was the first ride that I had with him on that boat, and I was happy to get off at that boat. And I was supposed to meet him at 5 o'clock that night to go for another boat ride. I remember coming around the game hall by the nursing station to go down and meet him, and I saw my father getting on the boat with my sister, and for the life of me, I couldn't figure out why he was leaving without me. And so I yelled for him, and he'd already had the kicker going, so he couldn't hear me. So I thought, okay, well, I'm going to go say goodbye to a few friends because I was leaving the next day. And by the time I made it over there and over here, there was maybe 20 minutes later, I was going back to my grandfather's. And I saw people running down to the water, and people were on Hondas going down there, all the men. And it was a lot of action, and one of the Hondas stopped, and they said, there's been an accident. And I said, oh, what happened? Well, your father's boat is upside down. So I got on the Honda with him, and we went. My sister ended up surviving, but my father didn't. So I stayed for another 10 days while they tried to find his body. And I'd already made the decision at that point that I wasn't going to be homeboarding. I was going to be with the rest of my friends at a Acacia Hall. And I still didn't understand everything. And when I arrived in Yellowknife after my father, but they still hadn't found his body. They found his body the day after I arrived in Yellowknife. I found out a week later. But then again, that is the Inuk way. There was a supervisor, Stobie, Mrs. Stobie. She introduced herself. She was the head supervisor. And she was the supervisor when my mother was going to Acacia Hall. So I thought, oh, I get to hear about my mother. And of course, the stories that I heard from Stobie was of this very astute, very prim and proper young woman that was nothing like I had come to know about my mother. And so I listened to the stories, and I was, wow. Well, then the first time I met my mother after my father died was about a month after arriving in Yellowknife. And I was 15. The liquor laws were different then. Children could drink in the presence of their parents, and they could go anywhere in the presence of their parents. Well, this was my mother, and I was at a hotel room with my mother, and she gave me some wine, and she began asking me questions. Are they bothering you? What are they doing to you? Are they? And I didn't know what she meant by these questions. No, nobody's bothering me. I'm doing good. I'm happy and going to school. I'm learning. I'm doing really good. But she was overly concerned with what others were doing to me. I still didn't get it at the time. I still didn't understand. And I remember going back to Acacia Hall that night, and I was allowed to stay out later because my mother was in town. And so you had to have special permission, and this was my mother. Acacia Hall didn't really know that my mother had not been part of my life until that point. And when I came in, I think it was 9:30 or 10, we were supposed to be back in 9, and Stobie met me at the door, and she goes, I smell you've been drinking. And she had this very dramatic way of talking at times. And I said, yes. Where did you get it from? My mother. And she, no, your mother would not do that. Your mother knows the rules. Well, she did. I don't believe you. Would you like to call her? Now, think of it this way. Being in the head supervisor's office, then there's a hallway. Just think of the two hotel rooms. This door is open, there's a hallway, and then maybe one room over with the door open. That's where the phone was. She went to go call my mother at that phone. And I could hear my mother from that distance just cursing Stobie out and just yelling at her. And Stobie asking her if she had given me wine. And of course, I could hear my mother, you have no right to tell me what to do with my... Well, that's a much cleaner version of it. And Stobie came back into the office. You can go to your room now. So I went to my room, and of course I had to attend the administrator's office the next day for punishment. But they couldn't punish me because it was my mother that had given me the alcohol. And normally, being caught drinking, especially in your first year, was immediate suspension, and you were sent home. But they couldn't do that in this case because it was my mother. So that was interesting. That started a very tumultuous cycle with my mother and the conversations, because the only time I would speak to her is when she was under the influence, and it was never pleasant, never pleasant. The times that I would hear the stories about my mother were from other people that she went to school with and that she'd helped, or about the work that she was doing here in Ottawa. She had very traumatic things done to her by the people she was placed in care with. I'm told that she would offer herself up, looking after the others. Her sisters and brothers would tell me these stories. She would watch the other kids. She would sneak them food. If they were being punished, she would comfort them. She'd acted like a mother. And that's something that I never had. I've had people tell me, well, you can adopt a mother. That's never the same. Never, never, never the same. I remember when I gave birth to my son Joshua. At that point, I was 22 or 23. When I gave birth to Joshua, I was 22 or 23, and he. At that point, my mother, I'd not had contact with her for about 2 years because I'd moved to Inuvik, and I thought that she had lost me. And in one way, I was kind of relieved, because when my mother was drinking, if she had my number, she would call and start cursing because I wasn't talking to her, or then the I love yous, tell me you love me, and I couldn't handle this, so I'd end up hanging up the phone. Well, if I hung up the phone on my mother when she was in those, my punishment for that was that she would call back every 5 minutes, cursing and swearing and yelling all night. So then you'd need to leave the phone off the hook, and you'd think that's going to solve it. If you did that, then that meant for the next 3 nights you were going to get that same punishment. So when I moved to Inuvik, I thought I was in the clear, especially having not heard from her for about 1.5 years, 2 years. I'd also not told my then boyfriend, who ended up being my husband, that I spent 23 years with. I didn't tell him about my mother and what my mother was like. From my experience, what my mother was like. So when I gave birth to Joshua, he was born on December 21st, 1992. I was discharged on the 22nd, but I was readmitted on the 26th. And somehow, some way, my mother found out that I'd given birth. My mother lived here in Ottawa. I was in Inuvik. And at the time, I worked at the hospital. And I was on the ward, and this is my second admission. The nurses, it was 11 o'clock at night, the nurses come to me and she's, your mother's on the phone. They're thinking this is going to be a pleasant call. As I'm going, what? So I go and I pick up the phone. Hello? Panic! You gave birth! Does your cunt hurt like mine did? I didn't know what to say. Yes, I bet it does. And I ended up hanging up the phone. And I went to the nurse's desk and I said, you guys have just breached confidentiality. You should have told her that I was here. Your punishment is now coming for the rest of the night. My mother will be calling you every 5 minutes. And I went back to my room. And I said, oh, by the way, I don't want to talk to her. And I did hear the phone for the rest of the night, but I was able to sleep. The next day, I found out that before she called the hospital, she had called my home, where my boyfriend had picked up the phone, and he has 3 sisters and himself, so he was the only male in his family, the first male to give birth. The next day, when I was talking to my boyfriend, I had found out that my mother had called my home. I have no idea how she got the phone number. I had no idea how she even found out his name. Like I said, she lived here in Ottawa, and I was up in Inuvik, and this was 1992. So I don't know how that happened. Apparently, she'd been keeping tabs on me through other friends, and I should not have been surprised by that. But the conversation with him went, with him, he is the only male. He has 3 sisters, and he is number 3 in the 4 children. So it was a big event for the first male to have a son. So when he picked up the phone, you also need to imagine from a Caucasian perspective, this is a very prideful moment for him. And my mother says, were you there when she gave birth? Yes. Did you see the baby come out? Yes. Did you help her? Yes. Are you going to stick your cock in that cunt again? But this is the language that my mother grew up with, because this is what she had been taught by those around her, because this is how they treated her. So I was mad at her for a very long time for this. This is when I started understanding what residential school did to her. This was also the same year that Phil Fontaine had made his announcement for the abuses that he had suffered in residential school. And this is when I started asking questions, because my mother had gone to school in Inuvik and Aklavik in Yellowknife, and I knew that there was others, because you're associated to people through your relationship to them. So people back then, it wasn't, hi, who are you? It was, hi, who's your parents? Because once they knew who your parents were, they knew who you were, where you were from, and the knowledge that you had. So you didn't have to explain all of that. So the common question asked to me in Inuvik was, who's your parents? And so everybody knew that my mother was Mochi and my father was David. So I'd heard many stories, many great stories about how great my mother was. And back then it was very contrary to what I was seeing, because I was receiving contradictory information. They would tell me all these great stories about my mother and everything that she did, but that's not what I was getting from her. And I did make the connection to the fact that whenever I did have any communication with my mother is when she was drinking, because I would not openly start those conversations. I did not want to pick up the phone to hear that berate of cursing and swearing, and whether it be cursing and swearing with love or cursing and swearing with condemnation. I didn't want it. I didn't understand it, and I was done with it. So it got to the point that when my mother would call, I would have to every once in a while just yeah, yeah. But if I didn't allow her to do that verbal diarrhea, I knew that it would be a day or two of hang-ups. So if I could tolerate that half hour of that verbal diarrhea, and if she said goodbye and hung up, I didn't hear from her again for another few months. Um, I got to know my mother through her friends and people that she went to school with, and the achievements that she did that way. Um, I got to know my mother through the work that she did because she was an interpreter. She was the best at what she did. So any time at that point with land claims, she was the one that they would get for legal interpreting and medical interpreting. But I never got to see that because of residential school. Back in '85, the rule that Acacia Hall had in Yellowknife was all first-year students. Their first year to Acacia Hall, it was mandatory for them to stay at Acacia Hall. Acacia Hall also had homeboarding. Normally, first-year students would not be allowed to homeboard. They had to learn the rules the first year and to be watched. After that, they could homeboard. They also had what was called the cluster. So homeboarding was similar to foster parenting, but not foster parenting. It was Acacia Hall paying for a room for you to live in, a house for you to stay at, and there was very strict guidelines. So you could, if you were a homeboarder, you had lunch at Acacia Hall during lunch, and you attended study periods, but there were very strict hours that you could go to Acacia Hall and what meals you could eat. And so my second year, I was homeboarding. They actually had to tell me repeatedly not to eat breakfast there. So Acacia Hall had very strict guidelines because they paid homeboarders or the homeboarding parents for your meals and for you to live in their home. And of course, I spent as much time as I could at Acacia Hall with my friends because I didn't want to stay. I was not asked if I wanted to homeboard. I was told to homeboard. But yet, I wanted to stay with my friends in the comfort of because I graduated with one of my uncles, and my connection to Joe Haven was through Acacia Hall. So homeboarding wasn't a problem for me, although my first homeboarding was with one of my boyfriend's parents. He was away at college. The second place that I was homeboarding with was with my social worker. Yeah, not too much of a conflict there, hey? She homeboarded many of us. Yeah, she'd also use us to go to bingo, have us play for her. Either way, that's a whole different topic. She was very good to us. She treated us the way that we wanted to be treated as if we were home, because she was also Indigenous, and she was Inuvialuit, so she knew what we were accustomed to growing up. So she gave us a lot of leeway. The cluster was at Northern United Place, which is NUP in Yellowknife, and it was only for students that were 18 years and older that could live on their own. So it was like a dormitory without supervisors. They were allowed to drink there. Food was bought to them, food was stocked, and they were expected to look after everything else themselves. So they didn't have the same rules that we had, but yet Acacia Hall students were not allowed to go to the cluster unless they were staying there. So during that time, there was it was 14 years after that it closed. Yeah, it was the last one to close in Canada, Yellowknife, Acacia Hall. So I first went to a Cathedral Hall in September of 1985, and I would go home for the summers. So in June we would go back, and I graduated in June of 1988. Um, I was pregnant during my, I got pregnant in my 11th year when I was homeboarding, um, and I gave birth in my 12th year, and I still graduated, and I breastfed that baby. I breastfed Davy, yeah. My mother actually went to residential school from the age of 4 to the time she was 19. My father met her when she was going to Acacia Hall, and they got married after she graduated when she was 19. Um, I'm going to say that the year that she graduated, or that she went to school when she was 4, I don't know her birth years. I know she was 20 when I was born. So I'm going to say that she was born in 49. So she would have went to school in 1953 to 1968 in Yellowknife. She first went to Inuvik, Groyer Hall. At some point was over in Aklavik as well. I don't know the years that she was there. And then her at least grade 8 to grade 12 at Acacia Hall in Yellowknife. There's, depending on where you went to school, there was different types of treatment. There's a blurry line in between with my mother's story as to which was worse. She has told others stories about how she would be hungry, and how she would save food for other students. There was times that she told us stories about students planning to run away and helping them collect the food so that they could go. Inuit students, I shouldn't say Inuit. Bear in mind that there are 2 land claims groups that are Inuit. So you have the Inuvialuit as well as the Nunavut beneficiaries, which are all but with Inuvialuit, we're much closer to home, with Nunavut beneficiaries being very far from home. The Nunavut beneficiaries couldn't run away to go home because, the flights were far too far, so they couldn't run away. There were other students that would run from Goyer Hall and Stringer Hall, and some that made it. There's a famous 3, with one that survived, 2 others that perished along the way. That story is known. The stories aren't communicated a whole lot. So, yeah. I want Canada to know. I want everybody to know what it was like. That feeling of homesick. I want the rest of Canada to know what it was like, not only for my mother, but also for me. That feeling of homesickness. During the time that I went to school, there was the option for us to go home. And my grandfather, there was many times that I would call and cry to want to go home, and he kept telling me, you need to stay, you need to stay, you need to get your education. And I did stay. My mother didn't have that same option. And from a very young age, being ripped away from everything that you knew, that your comfort, and being put into what she, I'm sure, thought was hell, and made to feel like she was garbage by all these different men, that, not just men, but also nuns, that in church would say one thing, and in school would say one thing, but then act completely opposite when they had her alone. Her self-esteem was shot, but yet she was such a strong woman. She had many demons that needed to be out, and she wanted to tell her story. and just couldn't find the mechanism. I want people to know her story. I want people to know my mother wasn't always like that. She was made that way. So when she was sober, my mother was this very helpful, very strong, brilliant woman. This was a woman who helped create names for that Inuktitut words that didn't exist. So medical and legal terminology to help Inuit understand, to help Inuit with land claims, to help Inuit with all of that. But at the same token, could not face her own image at night. And she would drink, and then that nastiness would come out, and just that heaviness that she must be feeling, and the hatred that she had towards men. That she was taught that. So don't condemn her for being the way that she was when it was society that made her into that. This woman was brilliant, smart, and beautiful, but was made to feel ugly and unwanted and like garbage. Because of that, I didn't have a mother. I didn't have somebody to hug me. I didn't have somebody to give me those teachings that mothers are supposed to, that you grow up hearing the advice. What the majority of Canadians take for granted, I never had. I didn't have the I love yous, that I'm proud of you. When I graduated, there was nobody standing beside me to say, you did this, you got it. Most people, when they graduate from grade 12, they've got their parents beside them. It's a huge celebration, and they're so, well, add on top of that being away from home and family. And I didn't have anybody beside me. I gave birth to a child in grade 12, and I didn't have anybody beside me. I got to where I am with my own 2 feet. My mother did that to me. Yeah. That's what I want the rest of Canada to know. A lot of societal issues that take place today stem back to intergenerational trauma. And I mean that in many different contexts, because my mother's father had also gone to residential school, and he did run away. He doesn't talk about it much because he didn't talk about it much. He just said that he hated it, so he left. But he was also a man that would travel from Aklavik all the way over to Inulik by dog sled. So one end of the Arctic all the way over to the other. We don't want this to happen again. And with the societal issues that are there, we need to understand how that first happened. So with the intergenerational trauma, if you understand what caused that, then we can get in front of it. Right now, everything is reactive. So you're reacting to the side effects, the homelessness, drug and alcohol problems, the spousal and physical abuse, the mental abuse, all of that. We need to get ahead of it, and we need to be a community again. And when I say community, that means leading towards reconciliation of being a community, being what we were, not what the government feels that we should be. Living the way that we did 100 years ago as a strong community, for the community, to build that up and make it strong. And that means the youngest all the way to the oldest, and being treated accordingly. We need to get back to that. And in order for that to happen, we have to understand what took place and address them, address those traumas, and acknowledge them. Because if we don't acknowledge them, then they were meaningless, and they weren't meaningless. They had massive harms, and until we can get over that, the societal issues that we face, such as homelessness and poverty, housing issues, food, all of that, that's not going to be solved. And we have to start at the beginning. So one thing that I didn't mention My mother was my grandfather's first child. Um, my grandfather was nomadic, and from the time he would travel between Igloolik and Pond Inlet over to Acclavik and back and forth. That's when they decided that he was the leader and would need to be a minister. So he traveled to um, minister to other Inuit people. Um, and my mother's mother was actually murdered on one of those um, trips. What happened was uh, when they were traveling from Igloolik over to Johaven, now Johaven, um, it was in springtime, and springtime is when animals are harder to hunt, and they were starving. So they stopped and made camp, and the women all stayed there, and the children, and all of the men, the old men and the younger men, all went out seal hunting, and they were gone for a couple days. But there was an older woman that had see, starvation not only plays on your mind, but it plays on your body too, and she went crazy and proceeded to go around killing everybody. My mother's mother saw what was happening. My mother was very young, like not quite a newborn, but close to that. And she went outside of the settlement, the little camp that they had, and she built another igloo, and she put my mother in there. And she went back and got another child, put that child in the igloo with my mother, and went back to get more. That's when she was murdered. The men came back the next day, and they had seal, they had food. But at that point it was too late, and the old woman, she'd even cleaned up all of the blood that had happened. And they found my mother and the other child, who apparently was a girl. And so when they arrived back, my grandfather, of course, needed to marry quite quickly because my mother was still breastfeeding. And they say because of this, my grandfather's first wife was his first love, and my mother was the only child from that marriage. So my mother, being his first child, was, of course, one of his favorites. And I, in turn, became my grandfather's favorite as a result of that. So after my father died, I lived with my grandfather. And his siblings also treated me the same way, which I'm thankful for. But what I lost was a mother. I hear all the stories of how wonderful she was and how powerful and how strong she was, and I got the sense of that when I get those very drunk calls, weeding through all of the verbal diarrhea that would come out. I knew that she loved me, and what she went through in school and helping all those other students not be harmed, like she tried to prevent all of that happening to other students, and she would give them food and she would help them, and if there was any students trying to run away, she would do her best to help. But it did, up to the day she died, she was still trying to escape residential school in her mind, and she just could not escape that. There were, I remember the last time that I physically saw her, my daughter was 4 months old. She was in Inuvik for a Paututik and ICC meeting, which is the Inuit Circumpolar Conference. She was interpreting for that, and they just happened to be doing the Paututik Inuit Women's Association meeting at the same time. And they were opening the new building in Inuvik, the IRC building, Inuvialuit Corporation, Regional Corporation. And they, at the opening to that, my daughter was 4 months old, and she took my daughter and we were all standing in front of the IRC building. She held my daughter over her head and was going, "This is the future of Paututi. This is the future." And all I remember thinking is, "Give me my child." What hurts the most is 2 days ago I was elected vice president of Paututik, and I'll never see that pride in her eyes. I won't hear her saying how proud she is of me, how I don't have somebody that will tell me, "You've done well." And lots of friends, I've got many friends around me that'll say, "You're doing good, you're doing good, you're doing wonderful, you've got this, you're so strong." But that doesn't feel the same as a parent's love. My daughter, when I landed here in Ottawa before the Paututik meetings, I landed, and the text that I had from my daughter was, "Come back, I need you." She's developed a flu and another infection, and she has a newborn. Well, he's 4 months old, and my 3-month-old grandson, 2 grandsons, and her boyfriend works in the mine, so he's 2 weeks in, 2 weeks out. And I couldn't do that with my mother. My mother wasn't able to teach me the things that a mother does. When I learned to sew, I learned from other women in the community. I sought out other women. I'll never feel that sense of pride of being somebody's daughter. And I'm making damn sure that I'm doing that with my daughter. I'm telling her how proud I am, even those simple things. "Okay, Natasha, your children are sick, you're by yourself, here's what we're going to do." And if she was going to the hospital, I said, "Okay, now we're going to think plan A, plan B, plan C. Best case scenario is plan A. Medium scenario is plan B. Worst case scenario is plan C. And if we think these out so that you're preparing, this way she doesn't feel so overwhelmed." I never had that. I never had the opportunity to share my children with my mother because my mother was too toxic around my children. I had to draw that line after that Paututik meeting because my mother didn't come see me when she was sober. I had to go to her. When I was going to her, she was drunk, and alcohol was more important. So I gave her the ultimatum. I said, here's how it is. You either give up alcohol or you give up your grandchildren. I'm not going to put my children through what you put me through. And if you call, you need to call sober. At that point, the only time my mother called was on my birthday at 7 in the morning. And that was the best gift that she could ever give because she was sober. And that may have only been 2 or 3 times, but it was the best because she made the effort. And I know she wanted better. There was too many demons. And my daughter knows this story. My son knows this story. My children, my grandsons, will eventually know the story. They know how proud I am of my family. And I'm instilling my culture in my daughter and my son and my grandchildren. And that's something that my mother couldn't do. My mother actually did not put forth any complaints. She died months before the announcement of the TRC. And if she were alive, even during the TRC, she would have refused any money. She had absolutely no use for white society. And I say that she died of cancers. She had cancer of the lungs, cancer of the pancreas, cancer of the liver. They said that the hole that was in her lung was so big you could stick your fist in there because she refused to go to doctors. She had absolutely no use for white society, white medicine. She had such hatred. So rather than saying use, that hatred was so ingrained in her not to trust, that they only wanted to do bad to her. There was no investigations. I never ever want any other person to go through this. I don't want anyone to feel the way that I do at times. There are times that I feel completely unloved and unwanted, and I know that's not the case. There are times that I feel that I'm completely unlovable, that I'll never have that because this is how I was raised. The word love has lost everything because I wasn't shown it. In my father's eyes, I was a possession. I was not a daughter. My grandfather was the one man on earth that loved me completely for me, and he died. I've never felt that love, and I never want anybody else to feel that way. I also want people to talk about it, because if you don't talk about it, then you're not going to reconcile that with yourself. And with things the way that they are now, you need to talk about it. You need to let it out, because there's others that feel the same way, and they're hiding that. Don't hide it. Let it out. Understand the root cause. Understand the root cause of what residential schools did and how that is ingrained in our fiber, in our being. That not only that fear, but that pride, that strength, resilience, it's all there. And we're still moving forward. We're still moving forward, and we shouldn't have to reclaim our space. What will now happen is we're going to say stop and push back and stand firm, which you're seeing across the country already. I have a real feeling of loss when I speak about my mother, because I never knew her the way everybody else did. I see her achievements. I know what the work that she's done. I know how proud I am of her. But that's not what I saw. The part that my mother ended up giving me after my father died was all that anger, all that bad energy. On one hand, she would say, "I love you," and then demand that I say it back. And it lost its meaning because I didn't know her. It was a demand. It wasn't, but that's the only way that she knew how to do that. I can't blame her for that, because nobody wants to be that way. That's how she ended up being, because that's how she was taught. That's the only way she could survive. And that sense of loss that I have, is still there. I feel that when I'm not able to share those same happy stories that I hear from other people about my mother, because I didn't get those happy stories from her. And I wish that I had a mother. I want that maternal love, and it can't be replaced. Yeah.